First thing I want to do is take off the wheel. If you have steel wheels with the hubcaps, you can use a little pry bar or screwdriver to gently pry the hubcap off. Just be gentle so you don't crack it or break it. Sometimes they get a little stuck. And with a 21mm socket, remove all 5 of your lug nuts and then take the wheel off. Next, I'm going to remove the axle nut. Before I do that, see how it's bent over here? I want to bend it out just a little bit so it doesn't drag the threads on the axle shaft. That's good enough. And then you'll need a 30mm 12-point socket to go over this nut. Remove the nut completely. Perfect. And another important step is to make sure that your axle pushes through the hub. If it's stuck in there, you can use a punch and a hammer and punch right in that little hole, push it through. You want to unseize it because if you pull the knuckle down and the axle comes with it, it's going to separate your inner joints and then you're in trouble. Take off this little clip that holds the ABS wire on. And then with a 12mm, remove that bolt. That's going to allow more slack for the brake hose as well as the ABS wire. To make things easier, I'm going to take the tie rod end off of the knuckle, remove the cotter pin, and you want to get a new one for when you reinstall. With an 18mm socket, remove your castle nut. Use a hammer, hammer right on the knuckle, and break the tie rod free from the knuckle. There we go. That broke free. With a 22mm socket, I'm going to take these 2 nuts off, hold the bolt side with a 22mm wrench. Do the same to the bottom. All right, take both of those nuts off. As you pull the knuckle down, make sure you press the axle through so it doesn't separate the inner joints. Perfect. Now you can let this hang right here. Make sure it doesn't put any pressure on the ABS wire or the brake hose. If you want to, you can take this little bolt off. That will basically remove the bracket that holds the ABS wire on the car. It'll give you more slack for it so it doesn't accidentally break. Now you can pull the axle shaft out of the hub and just set it aside. That gives us clear access to the ball joint stud. You can remove the old cotter pin if you can. Mine's pretty rusty, so I might not be able to. So I might have to just cut it and then take the nut off over it. If you can take the cotter pin out, go ahead. Mine's pretty rusted in there, so it's not coming off. I'm just going to cut it flush with the nut, hammer a socket of the appropriate size on, and I'm just going to take off the castle nut over the cotter pin. This nut is a 19mm. Hammer your socket on. You want to hammer it over the broken cotter pin. Perfect. Now you can get a swivel adapter and put it into the socket and remove that nut. As soon as the nut comes off, go ahead and start it on just a few threads. At this point, if you had your brakes apart, you could take the knuckle off, but what I'm going to do is reinstall the axle, bring the knuckle up, put it into the strut, start in one of the bolts just to hold it in, and put a nut on for safety. Now we can separate the ball joint from the control arm. You can use a pickle fork to separate the ball joint from the knuckle, or you can just hammer on it, but we're replacing this ball joint. Obviously that's what this video is about, so I don't care about damaging the boot. So hammer the pickle fork in. All right, now it's separated. Get this out of here. Now you can take the nut off the rest of the way. Now with a 17mm, remove these 2 nuts and this 1 bolt here. And out comes your lower ball joint. There it is. I'm going to start by putting it onto the knuckle first. Temporarily secure it with your nut. You can pry the control arm down with a pry bar. And you can bring the knuckle over to line up the studs of the ball joint into the control arm. Perfect, there we go. Start on your 2 nuts on the bottom. And lastly, start on the bolt. The new nuts are a 19mm socket. Snug those up. And the new bolt is an 18mm. Now let's torque these. Torque these 3 to 55 foot-pounds. Now that the ball joint is secured on the bottom, or at least mostly secured, you can take this off and we'll get easy access to the ball joint again. Make sure the axle pushes through. All right, remove the axle. Set it aside. Let's tighten that castle nut. With a 21mm socket, tighten up the castle nut. Now let's torque it. Torque this to 90 foot-pounds. Perfect. Now you'll notice that your castle nut slot has to line up with the hole for the cotter pin. In my case, it does not line up. You always want to keep tightening and never loosen the nut to line them up. So go over to the next slot by tightening. And that looks like it's right there, so that's perfect. Slide your cotter pin through, and then grab it from the other side. Just try to bend it upwards to lock it in. Push it through all the way. And then you want to hammer it down because right above here is the axle and you don't want it hitting. If any rust debris fell in here, make sure you try to fish it out. You don't want it to get stuck on the ABS magnet. And then put the axle back through the bearing. Slide it on. Then I'm going to put the knuckle into the strut. Line it up. Put one of the bolts through. Slide the bottom one in as well. If it doesn't line up, you can just wiggle it back and forth. Install the 2 nuts. Tighten them, or bottom them out, and then we'll torque them to 159 foot-pounds. If your bolt spins when you're trying to torque it, just hold it with the wrench. Go ahead and put the axle nut back on. I'm going to use my air gun to put it on, but I'm not going to tighten it. I'm just going to get it close with it so it doesn't take forever. Okay, from here on I'm going to torque it with my torque wrench to 217 foot-pounds. So you can put this pry bar on the ground. I just have it resting on my lift. And the reason we're going to do this is because otherwise the rotor is just going to spin, or the whole hub. Torque this to 217 foot-pounds. Go ahead and punch the axle nut back in right here to lock it. Go ahead and reattach this bracket if you took it off with this little bolt here. And now reattach the ABS wire right here, as well as the brake hose. Reattach the bolt and snug it up. Go ahead and put the wheel back on. Start on all 5 of your lug nuts, bottom them out, and torque them to 76 foot-pounds. Now don't forget your hubcap. When you put this on, make sure that this slot here, this cutout, matches with the valve stem. Otherwise, if you put it over here, it'll just smash the valve stems to the side. So match that up. Oops. Match that up, make sure it goes through, and hit it on there. Perfect. Now take it for a road test.